Hi everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. The underwater ephemera cookie I did a while back made such a splash, pun intended, that I decided to take the same basic fondant applique technique and apply it to a cookie with a completely different theme. So today we're going to be doing this lovely baby shower themed cookie. Whereas the background on the underwater cookie was airbrushed and stenciled, today I'm going to be stamping both the background as well as the fondant appliques. At the end of the video, I'll show you a couple different variations on the baby theme that do use a stenciled background. But today the focus will be on stamping on different media. So let's get started with what you need for this cookie project. You need at least 1 or 2 iced cookies in white, completely dry all the way through because we'll be stamping on them and applying a bit of pressure. My cookies are also about 4 inches across. I'm putting a lot in my vignette. You could definitely do a smaller cookie with the same technique, but I'm applying a lot, as you'll see. So I opted for a slightly larger cookie. I will be airbrushing the edges of this cookie, blue and green for sky and grass. You could also dust with some of the dust we're going to be using later, so the airbrush piece is completely optional. For the stamping part, both on the background of the cookie and the appliques, you need, of course, rubber stamps. I've got 2 big floral ones. We'll talk about the pros and cons of these a bit later for the background, and a number of smaller elements for the foreground pieces. I'm missing my stork. He's going to be a key focal point in this cookie, along with a teddy bear. For stamping on the fondant appliques, you need some white fondant naturally, a stamp pad that hasn't been used with anything but food coloring. This was previously covered with brown food coloring, and that's what we're using today. My normal liquid gel food coloring that I use in my royal icing is also what I stamp with. Once the appliques are made and dried, we want to give them just a light touch of color, really soft pastel shades that are in keeping with a baby shower theme. So I've got some compressed petal dust that'll do just the trick, and a firm square brush for dusting is excellent with these compact dusts. So you need at least a couple of those, one for dark colors and one for lighter colors. To embellish, as I said, there's going to be a lot on them in addition to the fondant appliques. We're going to have some piped royal icing roses. I have a whole nother video that talks about how to make those, so please check that out. We may additionally also use some piped daisies, and I talk about those and I think in my summer grill video. So very easy to make. Either flower will work beautifully on this cookie. And last but not least, we need a pasta machine. You could also use a rolling pin, but I find I get a much thinner and more even roll of the fondant for the appliques with a pasta machine. So it's worth the $50 investment or whatever it is to do that if you want to do this technique. So let's move on to planning this cookie. So when you're decorating a cookie as complex as this one, it often pays to plan it out on paper first. I would say it's most important to plan it out when you're stamping because not all stamps are created equal, meaning they don't all stamp equally well. But if you stamp them on paper first, you'll get a good sense of how they're going to perform on the cookie, and then you avoid wasting cookies that way. So we're going to plan out this cookie a little bit on paper to give you a sense of what I mean by that. I've simply traced my actual cookie shape on paper, and I've tried out 2 different background stamps. They're both wood-mounted stamps, and they're both kind of this natural red rubber color. Typically, this kind of stamp works really well on cookies. The food coloring adheres to it well, it doesn't beat up on it, and you get a nice clean imprint. However, in looking at this one, it's just very faint and uneven in several areas. Maybe that's due to the complexity of the stamp and uneven application of pressure. But I've tried this a few times now on paper and I consistently get that result. I did use this stamp on that cookie, but that was a lucky stamp. So I decided to try this stamp, and I find that I consistently get better results with it. It's also a little bit simpler, and so perhaps it's easier to apply even pressure to it to get uniform coverage. So I think I'm going to work with this stamp moving forward just because it's a little more reliable. I should also point out the stork stamp. I did find him, and it's a clear stamp. The reason I lost him in the beginning is he's clear and he got lost on my tool tray. But he's clear and he's a self-adhesive stamp, so he's stuck onto this acrylic mount. And this type of stamp, I'm pointing it out because typically food coloring is repelled on this stamp. It tends to beat up on it, and you get kind of a much more blotchy sort of stamp effect. So I did definitely want to try him out on paper. There is a little bit of unevenness, especially in this wing area. You can see some blotchiness of the coloring, but I think it's going to be acceptable for what we're doing, so I'm going to go ahead and use him. The other part of the planning process, once you've nailed down the background, is stamping some of the foreground pieces, making sure they also work, and you can cut them out of the paper and have some flexibility in terms of moving them around and arranging them. So this just gives you a sense of how you might design things, and more importantly, where you might want to locate your flowers so that they don't interfere with the foreground elements. So I think, since I'm going to be using this daisy, I'd like to locate the daisy slightly to the right of center so I have room for the stork here, and I can tuck the teddy bear down there, and I have a little bit of void there, maybe for this message, or maybe I put that over there. The other cool thing about planning ahead like this is you can also test colors. You can actually dust on these papers, and I'm just going to grab my glasses so I can see what colors I'm choosing. So you can try out color combinations before you even get too far. I think I'm going to do some kind of pink center on the daisies with yellow petals. So let's just see what that looks like. I've got a range of pinks here. Now I want to clean this brush off, ideally on a clean piece of paper towel before I go to a lighter color, but I'm going to blot it off here, and hopefully that'll be enough. I'm going to try this really bright yellow and see how that does. Sometimes the pale yellows don't really show up. It's a little too gold in color, so I think I might want more of a lemon yellow. So let me test this guy here. That's hard to see on the paper, but it might be a little bit better and softer given what we're going with. And I have another yellow in my other palette that might be even better. But again, it's really helpful to be able to do some of this on paper first before you get to a cookie and actually expend that cookie and waste it. Now we're going to move on to stamping. So the first step is stamping in the background, because we do need that to be dry before we dust on top of it. Otherwise the dust sort of commingles with the brown food coloring that we're stamping with, or sometimes smudges it. So to stamp, I'm just inking my pad again, because it was dried out, with a little bit of brown liquid gel food coloring and just wiping off the excess. I want it just damp, not wet. No coloring pooling on it. And as I said, I'm not going to do that one. That's a little more uncertain. We're going to use this guy. And then to ink it, it's often easier to do a big stamp upside down to make sure you've got good coverage everywhere. And that looks pretty good, and you don't want to let it dry too long. I am going to put it slightly off center and just lay it flat and then press harder than you might think. I've got this on non-skid material so the cookie doesn't slide, because you don't want that to happen either. And you want to press over every area where there's pattern, and particularly press close around the edges, because the icing can dip down in the middle of the cookie and you might make less great contact at these points where it's beginning to dip down off the edge, or even in the very center of the cookie. But basically I try to apply it everywhere. If your icing is dry, you might crack one or two along the way, so make a few extra if you're doing a large number. Now hopefully that'll look good. If we've missed any spots, hopefully they're all at the bottom where they're going to be less visible, because we're going to be putting teddy bears and storks and grass and stuff down there. Okay, that looks pretty good. If you're fussy about how it's stamped, I'm just missing a little bit of the petal here, here, and here. You can fill in. I'm not worried at all about these guys down here, because I am going to be putting other objects down there, flowers and whatnot. So I am just taking a very fine paintbrush, taking a little coloring off the pad, and do test it at the bottom of your cookie or on a piece of paper, somewhere it's not going to show, because you could pull up too much and have a very different color than what you've already stamped here. And I'm just going to apply it in small, short strokes, and that just fills that out a little bit better there on that edge. Similarly, we're going to do it over here. And that just makes it look a little more complete. Actually, this one's going to need to dry completely before we dust it, so I may end up working with another one altogether. But that's the basic stamping process in the background. We're going to move on to stamping now our fondant appliques. Okay, so we're on to making the fondant appliques, those small dimensional elements that sit up off the top of the cookie base and really give it some interest and dimension. To do that, I like to stamp on very thin rolled fondant. I'm rolling it out to the number 4 setting on my pasta machine, which is actually thinner than I typically roll it. This will be less than 1/16 of an inch thick once I roll it through. You could use a rolling pin, but I get much more uniform thin results with my pasta machine, as I mentioned before. We'll start it on the number 1 setting, which is most open, and gradually advance it through number 3 and then number 4. feeding it through like so. If there's any sticking to the roller blades, the fondant just needs to be dusted with powdered sugar or cornstarch. And that's getting really long on my number 3 setting, so I'm going to cut it in half. Now I'm just going to roll these smaller pieces through the number 4 setting to get the fondant about 1/16 of an inch thick, and then we'll be ready to stamp. I do like it to dry maybe a minute or two if it's at all tacky on top so the stamp doesn't actually stick to the fondant. The stamps I'm going to be working with are probably the teddy bear, this little message one, an assortment of tiny little birds, and of course our stork. Now our first step is to stamp them, and I like to let them dry overnight or several hours because they're easier to trim down to their actual size without smearing the imprint if there is some drying time. The fondant will be more rigid and the food coloring will be more dry. So this is something you could do well in advance and pre-trim and have these set aside in a box until you're ready to apply them. But it does require a little bit of advanced planning for the drying process. And we're stamping exactly as we did before. I'm pressing everywhere. I don't want to press too hard because I may just get the stamp stuck in the fondant. He looks pretty good. So at this stage, I would just kind of roughly cut him out. I'm not going to trim up all the way around him because I'll stretch the fondant. The fondant's now stretchy, and again, the piece is wet. But eventually, when it's a little more rigid, after a day of air drying, I can pick it up and trim it much more effectively. And I'll show you that in the next step because ultimately, we're going to end up with something trimmed down like so. Here's the clear stamp, and as you can see, even applying the food coloring, it's not so clear that you've got it everywhere. It doesn't show up as well, and it tends to bead up. That's what I mean about these clear stamps being a little bit less reliable, but let's see what he looks like once stamped. Hopefully he'll look better than he did unstamped. And again, that looks pretty good, but there is a little fuzziness here that you typically wouldn't get with a wood-mounted red rubber stamp. Just rough cutting him for now, and we'll trim him down much more closely later. So I'm going to stamp out a few more little birds, then clean this up a bit, and come back and show you how I trim down one of these pieces. This process for trimming would apply to all of the appliques. So let's start the trimming process. I like to trim them way back just so they look like standalone elements. As mentioned earlier, this guy's a little too floppy to deal with now, these ones I just rolled, because I run the risk of distorting the image. If I stretch them, I run the risk of smudging the imprint. So this is a piece that I dried overnight, if not longer. So the fondant's still cuttable either with scissors or with paring knives, but it is also prone to cracking, so you want to cut back or trim back rather gradually. For this round one, it's easy enough for me to use scissors to get down to the basic shape, and I'll probably come in with my paring knife to get in and around the little safety pins. I'm still taking care not to touch the top because if my hands are hot or sticky or wet, I can still smudge the piece even a day later. Okay, at this point, I would put it on the counter and do fine tuning with the edge of my paring knife. The edge here is a little ragged, so I do want to simulate that. I also want to come in and cut away around these safety pins, and so on and so forth. And it's really the same process with all of them. Again, he's too floppy to really deal with. Here's one that's dried overnight. This one's actually dried longer. You can see it's actually breaking away. Now, if it dries too long, you really run the risk of cracking it, so I have to be very careful about how aggressively I cut here. And I may not be able to get into all the tiny spots because it dried too long. So you don't want it to go too far either. But so far so good. As long as I cut gradually, I don't think I'm going to crack this piece of fondant. Now to get into these tiny areas, I'm going to use the tip of my paring knife and just cut away very tiny pieces. I could also use the tip of my trussing needle. Ultimately, we want to end up with something trimmed out to this extent. I'm going to airbrush the edges of these cookies. It's a nice way to kind of finish off the edge of the cookie, which sometimes eliminates the need for an added border. Plus, I want to simulate a little bit of green hue down here for grass and blue hue up here to about here for sky. Just shading, so I'm going to be operating my airbrush with low flow. This is my off position for flow. I'm going to be operating it at about 1/4 of a turn with food coloring at a distance because I just want a shadow of it. I don't want it really close up. I don't want a lot on the cookie, and I'll be pulling back very minimally on the trigger. Starting first with the electric green for the grass. I'm just going to hit the very edges. I don't want to airbrush the interior because I'm ultimately going to be dusting the daisies with compressed petal dust, so we don't want green on them. Once I'm done with that, I want to clean out the airbrush and turn to sky blue for the upper edges to simulate the sky. Again, the same technique, I'm airbrushing at a distance with relatively low airflow through the gun and minimal pullback on the trigger so I don't get a lot of coloring on the cookie. So we're ready to add color. Now I'm going to be dusting all the stamped elements, both the background and the fondant pieces. You could have also used these dusts to hit the edges, but I think the airbrush generally leads to a more uniform shading effect over broader areas, which is why I opted to do it. Now I've got two cookies before me. This is the one I just stamped. The risk of dusting it now is it might not be completely dry and I might smudge that brown, but it looks okay. And here's what I did earlier. It's certainly completely dry, but I don't like it because I lost a lot of the pattern down here, even though that will be covered for the most part. It just kind of bothers me. I also think the shading is a little darker than I had wanted, so not quite as pastel. So I am going to try to work on this one. We're going to do pink centers and yellow petals. And again, these are compressed dust, so you kind of need a stiff brush in order to dig out the powder. I tend to have one brush for light colors and another brush for darker colors, like the blues I'll do in this brush. So I'm gathering some petal dust on here, and I'm just going to do the centers in pink, and you kind of need to rub it in. This is going to be very subtle. This is more of just soft, subtle color is what I'm after because it's a baby shower cookie. You can knock off the extra or take a clean, dry brush. And so you can see soft and subtle, and that's kind of what I'm after. The dust will adhere better to the fondant because it's kind of rough and not as shiny and slick as the icing, and that's kind of nice because I want my foreground elements to be a little bit darker and pop off the more pale background. Now moving on to a lemon yellow color for the petals. Again, the process is the same. I'm using a very stiff, short bristled brush to really dig up that powder and then just rubbing it into the cookie. You don't need to be perfect. Don't worry about being in the lines. We're going for a really subtle, somewhat loose effect. And once they're all done, just dust off the excess powder. I am going to run a little bit of green up and around through here, around the stems, just to be suggestive of garden greenery. Again, using my light brush. This green I think is pretty good, but let me test it first. Again, you can also test it on paper. Yeah, it's nice and bright, and it's very close to that shade. And again, the same process, just rub in to get a light shade and then dust off the excess with a dry brush. So now we're going to dust some of these trimmed fondant elements, and then we'll do a teddy bear. And of course, we want to do all the pieces that are going to go on it, but they're all going to be done the same way. I'm going to start with my light brush, picking up some of the same colors I used over here so they tie together. And you'll see how the coloring shows up much more on the fondant, and that's just because the surface is a little more rough. And we want to get that pink out before I work with the yellow because it is kind of orangey. These are dry brushes, by the way. That's why I'm just dusting them out. I don't want water on them or I'm going to get a really opaque effect. So this is a dry on dry technique. And I'm just going to hit the little ends here with blue. I think this is the blue that I've used on this one. Moving now to my dark brush. And ta-da, the blue is down on the safety pin, so let's move on to the teddy bear. I'm going to continue with the same blue. Again, I like to use some of the same colors across the appliques and into the background so that the overall design looks cohesive when it all comes together. With too many colors, it could look just crazy. I'm going to do his whole body in blue with the exception of his nose area here and his feet, where again I'm picking up the same light yellow I used in the daisies. And the last touch will be pink on his bow. I'm using again the same pink I used in the center of the little message plaque. Onto the bird, same process, picking up a little purple for interest and the same blue as used on the teddy bear. So everything's dusted and it's time to put stuff on the cookie. Sometimes things will change from original plan to final plan, as in my case. I have just arranged my fondant elements on top of these daisies, and originally I was going to use my special delivery plaque, but I just felt that because this daisy was so dominant, I wanted less at the top, so I'm just going to do 3 little birds across the top. So nothing's glued now. You've got the flexibility to move stuff around until you like the arrangement, and that's what's kind of cool. And now I'm going to come and just lay the appliques. We'll come put the roses down last. For that, I like to use a little bit of thick royal icing glue white. I'm covering the zone that's not so good on purpose, and having the guy hang off a little bit adds some interest too. I think that's good. I also have a little bit of fondant here, so if you wanted to give him even more lift, let's try that. We could put a little blob of fondant under him and just raise him up just a touch. You'll notice that the icing does smudge the stamped pattern, so you have limited mobility to move once you put it down, which is why it's really good to arrange first. Yeah, and I kind of like him perching up a little bit more. At least we'll have him leaning forward a little bit. So you can add dimension with this as you like. This piece is rather fragile, especially at his beak, so I just want to make sure I don't put this down on his beak. And I think I'm just going to put him flat against the cookie. And maybe at an angle, like so that more of the daisy's exposed. I think that's okay. And not everything be straight up and down. That looks cute. I'm not pushing him all the way down because I do like the little lift that I'm getting there. And now we'll just put these guys down, same way. Now I do think I want some kind of border. I don't want one going all the way up the sides, but I do want to clean up these little corners, especially where I had tested my food coloring paint earlier. So I'm just going to put a little dotted border in these little notch areas. You could have done that before laying the appliques or after. Just as long as the appliques don't interfere with the placement of the border, you're okay. I think I can get access to mine. They're all pretty open. I'm just going to use this simple brown icing, a little beadwork there. And for beadwork, I use icing of beadwork consistency naturally. It's relatively loose. All of my consistency adjustments can be found in a link in the video description. I also think the brown icing ties very nicely to the brown used for the rubber stamping. Now onto the roses. These were clearly made in advance. They're completely dry. I typically do like to arrange them on the cookie first before I plant them down with icing, just to get a sense of the overall spacing. But I'm going to forge ahead here, planting the big roses first, and then moving on to smaller ones. The roses were a pale pink, and I dusted the centers with some of the same compressed petal dust just to accent the innermost petals. So we're just going to fill in with some leaves. I've got an Atico 349 here to start, which is actually a little bit bigger than the Wilton 349, which I'll switch to later. So I'm going to start with a few big leaves around the big flowers and then swap out to a smaller tip. Again, I'm using a really soft green because it's a baby event. And having them go in different orientations is always good. I think that's enough for big leaves. I'm going to swap out to the smaller tip now. You can see the difference in tip size even though they're the same number. Now with this smaller tip, I'm doing the exact same thing, just getting into all the remaining gaps and filling as many as possible. I want to cover overt seams. The piping motion here is pushing down to form a bead and then pulling back to create a peak. If the peak is at all rough, as mine is a bit here, it may be an indication that the icing's a bit too thick and you may need to thin it. But we're going to move forward. And that completes our sweet little baby shower cookie. I'm going to clean up a little bit and show you some other variations, some with stenciled backgrounds, some different stamp variations for other themes. So here's our finished product, as cute as can be. I just did want to point out you're not necessarily limited to one style with this technique, of course. I've got big daisies in the background. I've got another cookie up there with the other floral background, which has a mixture of flowers. You could almost stamp anything you want in the background. Of course, you could also adapt this whole technique. This one, again, is entirely stamped, both background and fondant appliques, but it's a garden motif. It'd be perfect for Mother's Day, a woman's birthday, even a bridal shower. And now back to the baby motif. You don't need to stamp in the background. You can in fact stencil the background. Here I've done a mixture of clouds and grass using two different stencils together, one from Confection Couture and one from Cookie Countess. I'm going to be showing how to do these dual type airbrushed and stenciled backgrounds in a follow-on video to this one where I do a beautiful still life applique cookie. Till that video, live sweetly.